Good morning, evening, and or day, O peoples of the internet. Before I get started today, two quick housekeeping announcements. The first, as return viewers will have noticed, is there is no intro music. There will also be no outro music, as last week's video on the T62 had a copyright claim. Not copyright strike, so significantly less severe, but I want to make sure that I actually have that whole music copyright licensure thing completely settled before I have that in any future videos, just to avoid anything happening, as I do have more plans for that moving forward. The second is that this video is going to be the first viewer-requested video of a sort, as there was a request for me to cover some of the less commonly discussed aspects of the Cold War and related topics, and I figured it would be a good little thank you and apology for the extra long gap that occurred between the T5455 and the T62 video. Now that that housekeeping has been taken care of, we can begin on the Stalin that wasn't, the last Soviet heavy tank. But of course, before we can familiarize ourselves with the last heavy tank, it would be a good idea to understand a little bit about the first Soviet heavy tank. Soviet tank development was originally Russian tank development, as they tried around with some interesting experiments, such as the Tsar tank on the bottom there, during World War I, but while the Russian Empire was rapidly industrializing, and there are intelligence reports you can find from the old German Empire discussing the fact that if a war came, it would be best that a war would come sooner with the Russian Empire, as if the Russian Empire was able to industrialize to the extent that the Western European powers had, it would be able to completely overwhelm Germany. But they weren't there yet. They were capable of producing shells by the million every year, but what would have been considered the high technology systems of the age, such as aircraft and tanks, the Russian Empire really wasn't capable of producing them at all, really, or if they could, in quite limited numbers. This would mean that when the Bolsheviks, later to become the Soviets, started their thing, there weren't any tanks around, until some of the, troops as well as supplies from the Western powers landed and would begin to participate in the Russian Civil War on the side of what is loosely described the whites, but I don't like that term, basically because the whites as a faction is just a catch-all term for all of the various forces that fought the Reds. The problem with that being that that includes everything from monarchists to more democratic revolutionaries wanting to bring about more of that Western European style government, to the Czech Legion, because at some point in time they were fighting the Reds, and in fact had the Russian gold supply. That's a fascinating story that I won't be covering, but it's fascinating. It would theoretically then also include the various independence movements in the Baltic states, Poland, and the Ukraine. It could also include groups that were part of the Reds and fell out of favor, so then we're fighting what were still the Reds. It's an overly broad term, but that aside, this aid would result in the Soviets getting their hands on their first tanks. Pictured on the top there is a British Mark V. Now, that's not a captured one. Those are Brits in front of it, but that's what they would have captured, as well as the various French tanks that would have been sent, although probably actually only FT-17s would have been sent. And that begins the process of foreign influence on Soviet tank development. The first domestically produced Soviet tank was the T-18, pictured above, also known as the MS-1, and this was developed off of the FT-17. Now, saying it was developed off of the FT-17 is a very broad statement. It doesn't mean it was a copy, it doesn't mean it's entirely dependent upon it. Simply, they had an FT-17, or several FT-17s, they studied it, and based off of what they learned, both from its design and its methods of construction, they built the T-18. By all reasonable metrics, the T-18 was not a good tank, but it was a very important tank, because it provided the Soviet designers with their first design experience with tanks, and Soviet industry with its first experience building tanks. Later on, there would be significant American influence. Quite famously, J. Walter Christie would sell one of his tanks, or, well, whether it's a combat car T1 or a medium tank T2, is dependent on which branch it served, because at the time, infantry branch were the only ones that could legally own tanks. So if it was under cavalry branch, it was a combat car, legally distinct from a tank. Whatever you wish to call them, these would become the Soviet BT series. The BT-1 was practically just a domestically produced, well, T1 or T3. Pictured at the bottom is a BT-2. These would, of course, be developed a little more generally into the T-34, which would, as I've covered in my T-54-55 video, become the basis for the true Cold War Soviet tank series. There would also be German influence, mostly in the form of the secret joint facilities that were basically operated in the deep interior of the Soviet Union. There was one for tanks, which was Kama, then there was one for aircraft, and one for poison gas. The experience that the Soviets got out of this interaction was mostly tactical, but there were some technical lessons that they learned. The picture below is not necessarily at Kama, but the assets that the joint facility had varied considerably. So it's not unrealistic that in the first little bit of its operation you could have seen something like that. Now, don't think that this is me taking shots at the Soviets. Heavy involvement of foreign designs as inspiration and origin for your own designs is not unusual, especially if you're not a tank-producing nation. That's how you start becoming a tank-producing nation. Further evidence of this, or any of you that may not be able to recognize from how I talk, I am from the US. So here is how our tank development started. On the left is a French FT-17. On the right is an American M1917. It is just a domestically produced FT-17. That particular tank is at the 1st Division Museum. I've been to, so I have actually seen and, I suppose, touched that tank there. Very neat museum. If you ever get the opportunity, I recommend it. A little bit more involved than just copying the French was working jointly with, and sort of copying, depends who you talk to, the British. On the left is a British Mark V. On the right is the Anglo-American Mark VIII, aka the Liberty or the International tank. The United States wasn't really producing its own tanks at all, and then when they wanted to, they had to go to people that already were, and learn from them. Soviets didn't have as much ability to, well, go and ask how you build your tanks, due to the whole, communism, death to capitalism thing. So they purchased some, they copied captures, there was espionage, the whole 9 yards. But of course, I haven't talked about the premier tank nation at the end of World War I, the British. British influence is not nearly as obvious. One of the main debates occurs over the Vickers A1E1 heavy tank, pictured above, and its influence on the Soviet T-28 and or T-35, pictured below. I don't particularly want to get into that argument, but here is going to be my contribution. direct influence or convergent evolution. During this time period, these can be very hard to figure out. For example, the very related to the T-28, T-35, the heavy tank. And to the left, that is the Neubaupanzer. Both of them have large caliber, low velocity guns in the main turret designed for infantry support. In the case of the Neubaupanzer, that turret would basically become the turret on the Panzer IV with its short 75mm. The main turret on the T-35 is a short-barreled 76mm gun, also known as the same gun that forms the light infantry gun sections in Soviet infantry units. Both of them had the main turret from a lighter tank as a secondary turret. In the case of the Neubaupanzer, that is the turret off of Panzer II, and in the case of the T-35, that is the turret off of a BT. Everybody was trying everything. So whether they arrived at this idea separately, or they heard about or saw someone else's and decided that was a great idea they wanted to try, is going to be quite subjective unless you can find very convincing documentation, which can be a bit of an issue on the internet when everyone just kind of likes to source Wikipedia. But what about other examples? How about having a casemate and a turret gun? American M3, French Char B1, both of which have a larger caliber gun designed for the destruction of enemy infantry and fortifications mounted in the hull, because that was seen at the time as the primary purpose of the tank, with a smaller gun mounted on a turret on the top designed to provide some anti-tank defense in case you were to encounter another tank. How about multiple turrets on things other than heavy tanks? American M2A2 there on the left, Soviet T-26, early T-26, in the middle, and British cruiser Mark I on the right. Everyone was trying everything. Tanks were new. But one thing that the Soviets can claim as unique and distinct to them is the fact that they actually fielded the giant monstrosities of multi-turret tanks that were their heavy tanks. Because, hey, you're the Soviet Union. It's not so much go big as go biggest, at the time at least. On the top there, we have the ANT-20, the Antonov 20, which went into production and was capable of carrying fighter aircraft as parasites. And beneath it, we have a sketch for the T-42, also known as the TG-5, might be TGV, haven't heard it pronounced, super heavy tank idea. This never entered production or got anywhere close to production. Those secondary turrets are BT turrets, kind of like you saw in the T-35. What these massive projects did is mostly propaganda work, as, well, for most purposes other than that, they were impractical, but man, did they look good on parades and in formation. That said, it didn't mean that there wasn't further development. The next generation of Soviet heavy tanks would come about, the T-100 and the SMK. These would be very closely related designs. In fact, there was a decent amount of joint development between them, and these were better armed, had better armor, and had better engines. But of course, these tanks, none of them really, had seen any combat. And then the Winter War happened. Soviet interbranch coordination was poor at the absolute best of times. Artillery, tanks, infantry, air support, yeah, their coordination was almost totally absent for the first portion of the war, resulting in the under-equipped and massively outnumbered Finns to punch unbelievably above their weight. But that would change as the Soviets figured out how to do modern warfare in a more coherent manner. And a part of that was a special experimental heavy tank unit, the 91st Battalion of the 20th Heavy Tank Brigade. This was mostly equipped with T-28s, as those were the standard, they were called medium tanks, but effectively heavy tanks at the time. They were also equipped with some BTs. The single unit of T-35s was located way in the south at the time. I believe they were part of the Kyiv military district at the time. They would also receive some prototypes of the SMK, the T-100, and the KVs. The KVs are the KV-1 and KV-2. KV standing for Klement Voroshilov, who was a Russian Civil War commander. These new heavy tanks outperformed the older multi-turret designs and the newer ones. If you'll actually note, the turret there on the KV-1 on top is basically the exact same turret as is the smaller turret on the front of the SMK and the T-100. And that turret is a 76mm gun, which is the same gun that was arming the new Soviet medium tank at the time, the T-34, which wouldn't see any use. I don't believe it saw any use in the Winter War. The one below it there, that is the KV-2, lovingly nicknamed by online gamers as the Russian Death Fridge, for reasons that should be fairly apparent. It was by far the more specialized vehicle, and only about 270 of them were made. Its whole point was, let's take a heavy artillery piece, strap it to a tank, and drive it in front of fortifications to make the fortifications go away. The Finns found this quite distressing. These are still your interwar tank designs, and at a certain point, the interwar period must end. And when it did, designs would have to change. And so the KVs would continue their development. The KV-2 would not really see any development. Its role would ultimately go to other more specialized and, let's be honest, better designed vehicles for the task. But the KV-1, that one had more potential. However, it did have drawbacks. Its heavy armor was appreciated, but its very poor mobility was not. This led to the KV-1S being developed. Lighter armor, better mobility. All should be good, but the crews still weren't particularly happy. It was a heavier tank than the T-34s that it would be operating with. It did have better protection, but it had the same gun. So, in many cases, you'd prefer the T-34 because while the KV-1S was more mobile than the KV-1, it still wasn't as mobile as a T-34. So, to answer this complaint, the KV-85 would be developed, which was a KV-1 mounting the new 85mm gun. Thus, it was less mobile, but packed a bigger punch. However, this was a stopgap solution until the next KV would be developed. Note there, that 85mm gun would be reappearing later on the T-34-85. Upgunning tanks is a very popular thing for the Soviets, and when they do so, they like to change the designation to include the caliber of the gun, hence KV-85 there. That next KV would be the KV-13, an attempt at the universal tank concept, which is a mix between a medium tank and a heavy tank. You may recognize that as a common definition for the development of what would become the main battle tank, or MBT, the design philosophy that is still how tanks are designed today. Now, there's a lot of debates over what the first MBT is. It's usually arguments revolving around, like, Panther and Centurion. This is not my schizo submission to that argument. Universal tank and main battle tank are related concepts, but they're not the same concept. As for the KV-13, it was designed to be a nice balance between the T-34 and the KV-1, but it, like, well, a lot of attempts to replace the T-34 during the war, to include the T-44 program, would fail. But another tank would go into production, the IS-85, later to be renamed the IS-1, the first Stalin tank. Quick note on the whole IS versus JS thing here. These are named after Joseph Stalin. In English, Joseph Stalin, JS, but if it's in Russian, Joseph starts with an I. If you want to think of another example, see the scene from Indiana Jones about the whole Jesus being spelled with an I thing. Same concept. Some sources say JS, most sources say IS. that's covered now. The IS-85, of course, named because of having that 85mm gun. Only about 200 of these were made because, while it was a production tank, it was still reasonably stopgap. However, the tank that was absolutely not a stopgap tank, the IS-2, the true start of the IS tank series, originally known as the IS-122, but later changed to be referred to as the IS-2. It was armed with a new, long-barreled 122mm gun and would be produced in the thousands. Entered production in 1943, although only a little bit over 200 would be made in that year. In 1944, you add a 0 to those production figures. These tanks would be in special heavy tank units, specifically Guards heavy tank formations, and these would be the armored fist that would make up the hardest assaults of the Soviet army during the latter stages of the war. These were very effective vehicles and were, to an extent, developed both inspired by and responding to the emergence of German heavy tanks. But of course, having made a design as solid and effective as the IS-2, of course had its faults, as all designs do, you needed a successor. What would come next? That would be the IS-3, the parade tank. The IS-3's main improvements is a different turret shape as well as a different hull form, the first mass-produced versions of the pike nose, which is that wedge in the front. These were initially to be introduced in 1944, but were so plagued with technical issues they wouldn't really be introduced until 1945, and, well, when they finally arrived in their units, Germany had, surrendered a couple of weeks ago, so they didn't see combat. One of the reasons that they were plagued with technical issues is there were still elements of the design that hadn't really changed from the KV-1, and the IS-3 is significantly heavier, so there was drivetrain issues, suspension issues, transmission issues, so just all kinds of, issues. These tanks would, of course, be most famous for their contributions into the third of the victory parades that happened in Berlin, when hundreds of these things would make up the Soviet portion of the third parade. Now, the psychological impact that these tanks had on the West is frequently overstated. However, they were taken seriously, and there's plenty of Western intelligence reports referring to it as such, though due to their mobility issues, their actual performance would likely have been significantly less than initially estimated. But we haven't hit the Cold War yet, so there surely must be more. And there are more. But first, what was their competition at the time? After all, competition drives innovation. Well, the competition at the time for the IS-3 was the American M26 Pershing and the British Centurion tank. Both solid designs, again, of course, with their flaws, and these would have very heavy influence, if not, in the case of the Pershing, pretty much direct descent into what would become the American and British tanks of the Cold War. So how did the Soviets develop? Well, numerically speaking, if we go to the IS-4, we have the failed successor. What would become known as the IS-4 was one of many programs going on to have essentially a better IS-2. New hull form, changing from a 122mm gun to a higher velocity 100mm gun. It's not the first time the Soviets did this. They did this with the T-34-57, which was basically just more specializing the gun to fight tanks by having a smaller barrel, so a smaller charge, less effective high explosive rounds, but specialized on velocity and armor penetration. Not many of these would be made. They'd be introduced in 1946, and were pretty quickly relegated to just the Far East Command, which is kind of where the Soviets just kind of threw stuff they built and didn't want. They'd mostly be turned into pillboxes on the Chinese border. But, every program has its duds. How about the IS-6? what I like to call the non-starter. This had two design boards that were competing for the contract. They were both kind of hiding their homework from each other, so there was no parts commonality between their ideas. Again, it was a attempt to get a better IS-2. This is actually where the pike nose comes from. They never left prototype phase, and their testing was between 1943 and 1944. Now, you may say, hey, wait, 1943, 1944, that's when the IS-2 was being produced. Yes, you kind of got to remember how quickly tank development was happening at the time. If a tank design was 3 years old during World War II, especially by the late war, like that was an old tank design, and everyone looked at you, with a bit of pity in their eye because you were severely outdated. The kind of tech gap that, in terms of tanks now, would be more like 30 to 40 years. Technological development in the Second World War was nuts. Numerically moving up, the IS-7, the big boy, the heaviest tank the Soviet Union ever produced. Armed with a 130mm gun, also known as the Object 260, its design was finalized in 1948, and they built 6 prototype models. It would never enter serial production. So, okay, as far as the IS series is going, really hit their stride with the IS-2, and they've been having some difficulty in the post-war period. But surely there's going to be another great. And there is. The IS-8, the tank this video is about. The Stalin that wasn't. Now, whether you refer to this as the IS-8, the IS-9, or the IS-10 depends on, what source you're looking at. IS-8 is most common, IS-9 and IS-10 are names given to some prototypes that would ultimately also become the T-10. The reason for it being referred to as the T-10 as opposed to the IS-8 or 9 or 10 is Khrushchev and his program of de-Stalinization. A very deliberate attempt to reduce the cult of personality that Stalin had at the time, as well as the sheer amount of government power that was in the hands of one man, which, even for the head of the Soviet Union looking at it, was considered a bit of a dangerous concentration of authority, which is saying something. Their production would start in 1952, but they would have no successor. They would be instead replaced by the medium tank-derived models, such as the T-64 in the Soviet Union's elite tank formations, which ceased to be independent battalions and began to form new divisions. These would be the Soviet Union's, depending on your source, either A-class or Class 1 divisions. These were mainly those that were on the border with the Western nations. These would be staffed 85 to 90% at all times. These were the first wave. These were the best the Soviets had, with the best equipment. That is where this tank went. Even when the Soviet Union was beginning to produce the T-54 in increasingly large numbers, this was their premier tank. This was the ultimate Soviet tank in the early Cold War. But it would also be the last Soviet heavy tank. The costs of the performance of a heavy tank just weren't worth it. And the Soviets weren't the only ones learning this lesson. Across the other side of the Iron Curtain, the Western powers were learning the same lessons at roughly the same time. On the left there, the British Conqueror entered service in 1955, the last British heavy tank. In the center, the French AMX-50, an early 1950s prototype vehicle that never entered service. On the right, the American M103, the last American heavy tank, entered service in 1957, leaving service in the mid-60s. Everyone was learning the lesson at about the same time. Because as guns were getting better, as ammunition was getting better, the introduction of the new threats, such as the ATGM, made armoring up a tank against these increasingly dangerous munitions to such a point that it could actually be considered worth it. Because, of course, as the armor gets heavier, You need a bigger transmission. You need a more powerful engine. That more powerful engine consumes more fuel. You need bigger fuel tanks. All of this increasing the size of the tank, which means your armor has to increase volumetrically, which of course increases weight in a vicious design cycle. The heavy tank had given World War II some of its most iconic tanks, like the Tiger, like the IS-2. Even if you want to categorize it, the mid to late war British I-tanks, the Churchills. If you want to include the American Jumbo, go ahead. The super heavy, I mean weight, tank destroyers, such as those Jagdpanzers and the Jagdtigers. You want to talk about the very heavy Soviet assault guns, these huge vehicles. The Soviet assault guns' hulls were so thick that as part of the response to the Chernobyl disaster, they were pulled out of the boneyards to basically be demolition vehicles, to bulldoze through and, well, then over buildings around the reactor, because that armor was so thick, it was considered to be a radiation shield. And some of those tanks are still there today, as one of many silent reminders of that disaster. But within a decade of the end of World War II, the heavy tank, something that the war really created as a design, was dead, and everyone was realizing it. Moving on to the new MBTs, the main battle tanks, that was just as lethal, but smaller, faster, cheaper, and, all things considered, wasn't actually that much more lightly armored. I know I spent most of the time in this video talking about the history leading up to the T-10, and not talking about the history of the T-10 itself, because, well, the T-10 doesn't really have that much history. It entered service, it stood on the border, and that was kind of it. There's some reports of some of them being exported in the earlier Cold War period and seeing action, particularly, for example, against Israel, but those are, in all likelihood, just misidentifications of other Soviet heavy tanks, often brought up as the potential of it being mistaken for an IS-3. And for the most part, that's the legacy, the culmination of decades of design, of work, of experience into these behemoths. But the T-10 isn't simply the last Soviet heavy tank. The T-10 would receive modernizations. Unlike the other ones, it stayed in service for a long time. The American M103 was gone by the late 60s. The Centurion was into deep reserves, decommissioned, exported to other countries and that, but also quickly fell off. Lasted a little bit longer than the M103, but not necessarily all that much. But the T-10, as can be seen on this picture, that's an IR searchlight. These were being modernized. These were kept in service because they were the elite tank up until the T-64s would replace them. The T-10 only left Soviet service in the mid-80s, partially because the Soviets don't like throwing stuff away, particularly tanks. So, because of that departure, because of that end to their service lives, the T-10 isn't just the last Stalin tank. It's not just the last Soviet heavy tank. The T-10 is the last heavy tank. And as the last heavy tank, it represents a bit of an end of an era in armored warfare and armored development. Nobody's designing tanks to be able to sit there and face tank shots from their contemporaries. Tanks now are designed to avoid being hit, to get the first shot, to get the first kill, and move before any return fire can come in, because ammunition is just so deadly now, it's impossible to armor tanks enough. There are other technological advancements, of course. ERA, active protection systems, IR dazzlers. All of these things exist. All of these things are important. But the main protection of tanks now isn't their hull. It's other features. The T-10 is the last of that design paradigm. a design philosophy that ultimately became outdated due to the furious technological advances made in the Cold War period. So, that is my summary of the T-10, the IS that wasn't, and the last heavy tank in the world. I hope you enjoyed. Have a nice day.